They called him a killer, a black stallion that had put 3 men in the hospital and destroyed everything in his path. At the Pinewood County auction, a girl with dirt under her fingernails and holes in her boots raised her hand with a crumpled $100 bill, and the entire fairground erupted in disbelief. What she did next would shake this small Wyoming town to its core and prove that sometimes the most broken things aren't meant to be fixed, they're meant to be understood. This isn't a story about breaking a wild animal. It's about 2 souls recognizing the same scars in each other. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September sun hung low over Pinewood County, casting long amber shadows across the fairground that stretched like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. The livestock auction barn sat at the edge of the property, a massive structure of weathered wood and corrugated steel that had witnessed decades of transactions. Fortunes made and lost, dreams bought and sold. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of animals, sawdust, and the particular musk of nervous anticipation that comes when money and pride collide. Boots shuffled against concrete floors worn smooth by generations of ranchers. Voices rose and fell in waves, punctuated by the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel and the occasional bellow of cattle being moved through the holding pens. The bleachers were packed with the usual crowd. Ranchers in pressed shirts and polished belt buckles, their wives clutching thermoses of coffee, young cowboys trying to look older than their years, and the curious townspeople who came for the spectacle rather than the business. The smell of kettle corn drifted in from the fairground outside, mixing with diesel fumes from idling trucks and the sweet hay scattered across the auction floor. A loudspeaker crackled with static between lots, and somewhere in the distance a child's laughter rang out, oblivious to the tension building inside the barn. Grace Bennett stood near the back in trance, partially hidden by a support beam, her fingers wrapped around the strap of a canvas backpack that had seen better days. She had arrived before dawn, watching the trucks roll in with their precious cargo, noting which animals moved with ease and which ones carried the weight of mishandling in their eyes. Her jeans were faded almost white at the knees, her flannel shirt missing a button near the collar, and her boots were the kind that had been resoled twice and would probably need it again soon. She didn't belong here, not among the established ranchers with their lines of credit and family names that went back generations. She was a ghost at the edges of their world, and she preferred it that way. The auctioneer, a man named Carl Winters whose voice had the texture of gravel rolling down a tin roof, stood at his podium with a microphone headset that made him look like he was conducting an orchestra of chaos. He had been doing this for 30 years, and his cadence was hypnotic, numbers tumbling from his mouth in a rhythm that seemed both frantic and utterly controlled. Lot after lot moved through the ring. A pair of draft horses that went for more than Grace made in 6 months. A dozen head of cattle that sparked a bidding war between 2 ranchers who clearly had history. A pony that a little girl in the front row begged her father to buy, her pleas loud enough that half the barn smiled despite themselves. Then the energy shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple of whispers starting near the front and spreading backward like wind moving through tall grass. Heads turned. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Even the auctioneer paused, taking a long drink of water as if steeling himself for what came next. The large sliding door at the far end of the barn groaned open, and 4 ranch hands appeared, struggling with a horse that seemed to be made of compressed lightning and fury. The stallion was pure black, his coat so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He was tall, powerfully built through the chest and shoulders, with legs that looked like they could kick through steel. His eyes were wide, the whites showing, and foam flecked his muzzle where the rope halter dug into his flesh. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, ready to explode. The men holding him were sweating despite the cool autumn air, their knuckles white around the lead ropes, their boots digging into the dirt for purchase. One of them had a fresh bruise blooming purple across his cheekbone. Another limped slightly, favoring his left leg. They moved with the cautious urgency of people handling something they knew could end them in a heartbeat. When they finally got the stallion into the center ring, the horse reared, forelegs slashing the air, and a collective gasp rose from the crowd. Parents pulled children back. Men who had worked with horses their entire lives took an involuntary step away from the rails. The auctioneer cleared his throat, the microphone amplifying the nervous sound. Lot 17, he announced, his usual enthusiasm notably absent. Black stallion, approximately 6 years old, formerly of Hartwell Ranch. No papers, no guarantees, sold as is. He paused, consulting his notes with obvious reluctance. This animal has a documented history of aggressive behavior. Prospective buyers are advised to exercise extreme caution. The barn, which moments before had been buzzing with conversation, fell into an uneasy silence broken only by the stallion's labored breathing and the scrape of his hooves against the dirt. In the front row, William Hartwell sat with his legs crossed, a cream-colored Stetson resting on his knee, watching the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a minor inconvenience being resolved. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair combed straight back and a face that had never known real hardship. His boots were custom-made, his watch cost more than most people's trucks, and his ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of prime Wyoming grazing land. He had inherited wealth and multiplied it through shrewd investments and a willingness to make decisions that kept sentiment far away from business. The stallion had been a mistake, an impulsive purchase made by his late son 3 years ago, before the accident that had taken the boy's life and left Hartwell even harder than he had been before. The horse was a reminder of loss, and Hartwell had no use for reminders. The auctioneer tried to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. Let's start the bidding at $5,000 for this fine animal. His words hung in the air, met with absolute silence. Not a hand moved, not a voice called out. 5,000 became 4,000, then 3, then 2. The numbers dropped like stones into still water, each one creating ripples of awkward shuffling and averted eyes. The stallion, as if understanding he was being discussed, pawed the ground with enough force to send dust billowing into the shafts of sunlight cutting through the barn's high windows. One of the handlers jerked backward as the horse's head swung in his direction, teeth bared. Finally, a voice called out from the middle section, 500. It was offered not as a serious bid but as a mercy, something to break the terrible silence and allow everyone to move on. The auctioneer seized on it gratefully. 500, I have 500. Do I hear 600 for this powerful animal? Another voice, tinged with dark humor. 600, but only if you throw in the hospital bill. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind that has an edge of cruelty to it, born from discomfort and the need to reassert control over a situation that felt dangerous. The bidding crept upward in reluctant increments, each number called out as if the bidders were daring each other rather than actually wanting to purchase the horse. Grace watched all of this from her position by the beam, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had heard about this horse weeks ago, back when she was still in Nevada, working double shifts at a truck stop diner and sleeping in her pickup in the parking lot. A trucker had mentioned it in passing, talking about some ranch in Wyoming that was trying to get rid of a devil horse that had nearly killed a man. Something about the story had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter. She had saved every tip, every dollar, until she had enough for gas and a little extra. She had driven 14 hours straight, following nothing but intuition and the ghost of her father's voice in her head telling her that sometimes the most dangerous animals were just the most scared. The bidding stalled at $800. The auctioneer looked around hopefully, but the barn had gone quiet again except for the stallion's increasingly agitated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Agitated movements. The horse's ears were pinned flat against his skull, his tail lashing, and his breathing had taken on a ragged quality that spoke of panic barely contained. Grace could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way his weight shifted constantly as if he was looking for an escape route that didn't exist. This wasn't aggression, not really. This was terror wearing the mask of violence because it was the only defense he had left. Going once, the auctioneer called, his gavel raised. Going twice. His eyes scanned the crowd one final time, already preparing to bring the hammer down and mark this lot as unsold, a problem to be dealt with elsewhere. Grace felt her hand move before her brain fully registered the decision. It rose from her side, fingers outstretched, the gesture small but unmistakable. Her voice, when it came, was steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. $100. The effect was immediate and total. Every head in the barn swiveled toward her. The auctioneer's mouth actually fell open, his gavel frozen mid-descent. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then the laughter started. It began as scattered chuckles from the back rows, grew into guffaws from the middle sections, and finally erupted into full roaring laughter that echoed off the metal roof and wooden walls. People pointed. A woman in the third row actually had tears streaming down her face from laughing so hard. A young cowboy slapped his knee and said something to his friend that made them both double over. $100, someone repeated, their voice dripping with disbelief and mockery. For that monster. The words were picked up and passed around like a cruel joke. She's gonna get herself killed. Somebody call the coroner now, save time later. That horse is worth more as dog food. Look at her. She probably doesn't even have $100. The comments came from all directions, each one landing like a blow. Grace felt her face flush hot, but she kept her hand raised, kept her eyes forward. She had learned long ago that showing pain only made people enjoy inflicting it more. Carl Winters, the auctioneer, removed his headset and rubbed his face with both hands, clearly trying to figure out if this was some kind of prank. Miss, he said, his voice gentler without the microphone's amplification, are you aware of this animal's history? This isn't a backyard pony. 3 men have been hospitalized because of this horse. One of them still walks with a cane. Grace nodded, her throat too tight for words. Winters sighed deeply, looking out at the crowd as if appealing for someone to talk sense into her. But the laughter had subsided into a watchful silence, everyone waiting to see how this absurd situation would resolve itself. William Hartwell had turned in his seat, his pale blue eyes studying Grace with the clinical interest of an entomologist examining an unusual insect. He made a small gesture to the man beside him, Marcus Webb, his ranch foreman, a thick-shouldered man with a face like weathered leather. Webb leaned in, and Hartwell whispered something that made the foreman nod and pull out a phone, stepping away to make a call. Hartwell's expression never changed, but there was something calculating in his gaze, as if he was already several moves ahead in a game Grace didn't yet know she was playing. The rules are the rules, Winters finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. The young lady has made a bid of $100. He paused, giving one last chance for someone to intervene. Hearing no other bids, Lot 17 is sold for $100 to the young lady in the back. The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. The laughter swelled again, accompanied now by slow mocking applause. A few people actually stood, giving her a standing ovation dripping with sarcasm. Congratulations. Hope you got good life insurance. Better write your will tonight. Somebody film this, I want to see the YouTube video when it all goes wrong. Grace moved forward through the crowd, which parted for her the way people might step aside for someone walking to their own execution, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, operating on autopilot while her mind screamed questions at her. What are you doing? You can't handle this. You're going to die. But beneath the fear was something else, something that had pulled her across state lines and kept her going through the ridicule. It was the same thing that had made her father approach injured animals that everyone else had given up on. It was the stubborn belief that understanding was stronger than force, that patience could accomplish what violence never would. She reached the ring, where the ranch hands still struggled to control the stallion. One of them, a younger guy with a fresh scratch across his forearm, looked at her with something approaching genuine concern. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you really don't want to do this. This horse is dangerous. He's not mean, he's broken. There's a difference, and the broken ones are worse because they've got nothing left to lose." Grace met his eyes and saw that he meant it kindly, that he was trying to save her from a terrible mistake. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement but didn't back away. "Sometimes broken is just another word for unfinished," she said, so quietly that only he heard her. The paperwork was minimal. processed by a county clerk who kept looking up at Grace as if expecting her to change her mind at any moment. Grace counted out her money with shaking hands, 5 20s that represented everything she had budgeted for food for the next 2 weeks. The clerk pushed a form across the desk. Sign here, and initial here acknowledging that you've been informed of the animal's history and that the seller bears no responsibility for any injuries or damages. Grace signed, her handwriting barely legible. When she looked up, William Hartwell was standing a few feet away, watching her with those cold blue eyes. He tipped his hat, the gesture somehow more insulting than any of the laughter had been. "Good luck, miss," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "You're going to need it." Then he turned and walked away, Marcus Webb falling into step beside him, their conversation too low to hear. Outside, the ranch hands had managed to load the stallion into a decrepit livestock trailer that looked like it had been pulled from a junkyard. The metal was rusted in places, the wooden slats patched with mismatched boards, and the whole thing rattled ominously with each of the horse's movements. Grace's truck was already hitched to it, though she didn't remember authorizing that. Apparently, they wanted this transaction completed as quickly as possible. One of the hands, the older one with the limp, handed her the lead rope through the trailer's side window. His name was stitched on his work shirt. Pete. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I've worked with horses for 40 years, he said, "and I've never seen one this far gone. If you've got any sense, you'll take him straight to the auction yard in Casper and sell him for meat. At least then his suffering ends quick." Grace took the rope, feeling the weight of it, the vibrations traveling up from where the stallion pulled and thrashed inside the trailer. "Thank you for your concern," she said, and meant it. Pete shook his head slowly and walked away. Grace climbed into her truck, a battered Ford with over 200,000 miles on it, the passenger seat covered in maps and empty coffee cups, the back seat stuffed with everything she owned in black trash bags. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, the key turning in the ignition with a grinding sound that made her wince. The engine caught, coughed, then settled into its familiar rough idle. Through the rearview mirror, she could see the trailer swaying with the stallion's movements, could hear the metallic banging of hooves against steel. Behind her, the auction barn was already moving on to the next lot, her moment of infamy already becoming an anecdote people would tell over beers. "Did you hear about the crazy girl who bought the killer horse for $100? Wonder how long she lasted." She pulled out of the fairground slowly, the trailer creating ominous sounds behind her, and pointed the truck toward the address Tom Fletcher had given her 3 days ago when she had cold called him after finding his name in an old horse training directory at a library in Nevada. He had sounded ancient on the phone, his voice crackling with age and what might have been amusement. "You want to rent my barn? Nobody's used those stalls in 5 years, not since my wife passed. But if you're serious, I suppose I could use the company." And the money, though he hadn't said that part out loud. They had agreed on a price that was barely anything, and he had promised the property was private, set back from the road, away from prying eyes. As Grace drove through Ridgefield, the small town that served as Pinewood County's heart, she saw faces turn to watch her pass. Word had already spread, the small-town gossip network moving faster than any internet connection. In front of the Copper Kettle Diner, a group of older men stood with coffee cups, one of them saying something that made the others laugh and shake their heads. At Anderson's Feed and Supply, the owner, Frank Anderson, stood in the doorway watching her trailer pass, his expression unreadable. A sheriff's cruiser was parked outside the courthouse, and she saw Sheriff Morrison note her license plate, probably running it through his system just to see who the stranger was and whether she had any warrants. Grace kept her eyes forward and drove on. The road out of town climbed into the foothills, pine trees closing in on both sides, their shadows long and cool across the asphalt. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow that glowed pink in the fading light. Crystal Creek appeared and disappeared beside the road, its water running clear and fast over smooth stones. Grace rolled down her window, letting the crisp air flood the cab, carrying the scent of pine sap and distant wood smoke. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to let the beauty of this place wash over the ugliness of the past hour. Then a particularly violent crash from the trailer reminded her that beauty and danger often traveled together. Fletcher's farm appeared around a bend, marked by a faded wooden sign that read Fletcher's training grounds in letters that had once been red but had weathered to a pale pink. The driveway was gravel, deeply rutted, lined with fence posts that leaned at various angles like tired sentries. The barn sat about 200 yards back from the road, a classic gambrel roof structure that had been red once but was now a patchwork of faded paint and bare wood. White trim around the windows and doors gave it a dignified air despite its age. Behind the barn, pastures rolled away toward the tree line, grass gone golden with the season, dotted with patches of sage and wild flowers that had gone to seed. The main house was a small ranch-style structure with a covered porch where an elderly man sat in a rocking chair, a blanket across his knees despite it not being that cold yet. Tom Fletcher was 90 if he was a day, with white hair that looked like it had been cut with a bowl and dull scissors, skin tanned to leather by decades of outdoor work, and eyes that were still sharp behind thick glasses. He raised one gnarled hand in greeting as Grace pulled into the yard, the trailer rattling to a stop. He made no move to get up, just watched as Grace climbed out of the truck on legs that felt like they might give out. "Made it," he called, his voice surprisingly strong. "Wasn't sure you would, the way you described that horse on the phone." Grace managed a weak smile and walked over to the porch. "Mr. Fletcher, thank you for this. I know it's unusual." Tom waved away her thanks. "Unusual is just another word for interesting, and Lord knows I could use some interesting. Place has been too quiet since Martha died." His eyes drifted to the trailer, where renewed crashing sounds indicated the stallion was not enjoying his confinement. "That him?" Grace nodded. Tom whistled low. "Well, you certainly don't do things halfway. Barn's open, stalls are dusty but sound. Water's running to the troughs. There's some old hay in the loft that's probably still good. You need help unloading him?" Grace looked at the trailer, then at Tom's ancient frame and blanket-covered legs. "I think I need to do this part alone," she said. Tom nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Sometimes the best help is knowing when to stay out of the way. I'll be right here if you need me, which means I'll be right here regardless, but it sounds more useful to say it that way." Despite everything, Grace laughed, a short, surprised sound that felt good in her chest. She walked to the barn, pulling open the large sliding door that moved more smoothly than she expected. Inside, the smell of old hay and dust and years of animal warmth greeted her. 6 stalls lined one wall, their doors hanging open, hardware rusty but intact. The concrete floor was swept clean, and evening light poured through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like microscopic stars. Grace backed the trailer up to the barn entrance, the beeping of her truck's reverse alarm loud in the quiet. She set the parking brake, turned off the engine, and stood for a moment in the sudden silence, broken only by the stallion's breathing from inside the trailer. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that this was insanity, that she should listen to Pete and take this animal somewhere else, let someone else deal with the consequences. But her father's voice was louder. "The most dangerous thing you can do with a scared animal is give up on it, Grace, because then it knows for certain that nobody's coming to help." She walked to the back of the trailer, unlatched it with hands that shook so badly it took 3 tries, and pulled the door open. The stallion exploded backward, hooves clanging on the metal ramp, nearly knocking Grace sideways. She stumbled but kept hold of the door, pressing herself against the side of the trailer as the horse burst into the fading daylight. He was even more magnificent out here, away from the confinement and chaos of the auction. His black coat seemed to absorb the last rays of sun. His mane whipped around his neck, and his eyes were wild but not empty. Not empty at all. They were filled with something Grace recognized because she saw it every time she looked in a mirror. They were filled with loss, with betrayal, with the desperate need to trust something again, but the absolute terror of what would happen if that trust was broken one more time. The stallion reared, forelegs striking the air, a sound coming from deep in his chest that was part challenge and part plea. Grace stood completely still, making herself small, non-threatening, just breathing. The horse came down, spun in a tight circle, then stopped, sides heaving, staring at her across 20 feet of dusty ground. They looked at each other, predator and prey, human and animal, two beings who had both learned that the world could hurt you in ways that left scars deeper than skin. Grace didn't move toward him. She didn't speak. She just stood there, letting him see her, letting him make the choice. Behind her, from the porch, she heard Tom's rocking chair creak, but he said nothing. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Grace had been able to look away from the stallion's eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the stallion's ears swiveled toward the sound, but his gaze never left Grace. The day's last light caught the white foam on his muzzle, the scratches on his chest where he had fought the rope, the trembling in his powerful legs that spoke of exhaustion beyond the physical. Grace took one slow breath, then another, matching the rhythm she could see in the rise and fall of his ribs. And in that moment, as the sun finally dipped below the mountains and the first stars began to appear, she made him a silent promise. I won't try to break you. I won't try to fix you. I'll just be here, for as long as it takes, until you decide whether there's anything in this world worth trusting again. The first 3 days passed in a blur of careful distance and cautious observation. Grace slept in her truck those first nights, the driver's seat reclined as far as it would go, a sleeping bag pulled up to her chin, waking every hour to the sound of hooves striking wood or the high-pitched scream that horses make when they're beyond simple fear. Each time she jolted awake, her heart racing, she would peer through the windshield at the barn, seeing the faint movements in the darkness, hearing the stallion pace his stall like a caged storm. Tom had offered her the spare bedroom in his house, but she had declined, needing to be close, needing to hear if something went catastrophically wrong in the night. On the fourth morning, she woke to find frost coating her windshield in delicate patterns that looked like feathers, and her breath clouding the interior of the cab. Her back ached from the cramped position, and her neck had a permanent crick that made turning her head an exercise in gritted teeth. She pushed open the truck door, the hinges protesting with a squeal that seemed obscenely loud in the pre-dawn silence, and stepped out into air so cold it burned her lungs. The sky was that particular shade of purple that comes just before sunrise, stars still visible but fading, the mountains dark silhouettes against the coming light. The barn was quiet. Grace approached slowly, her boots crunching on frost-hardened grass, each step deliberate and announced. She had learned in those first days that sudden appearances sent the stallion into a frenzy, so she made noise, hummed under her breath, let him know she was coming long before she arrived. The barn door stood partially open from the night before, and she slipped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the deeper darkness. The smell was stronger now, the sharp ammonia of urine mixed with the earthier scent of manure and the sweet dustiness of hay. She would need to muck out the stalls today, but that would require getting closer than the stallion had yet allowed. He stood in the largest stall at the far end, his dark form barely distinguishable from the shadows except for the occasional gleam of his eyes catching what little light filtered through the high windows. His head was high, ears forward, tracking her movement. Grace moved to the feed room, a small space that had once been organized but now held only a few bales of hay Tom had managed to procure from a neighbor, and the bag of grain Grace had purchased at Anderson's feed and supply the day after the auction. Frank Anderson had taken her money without comment, but his eyes had held a question he never voiced. She filled a bucket with grain, the sound of it pouring like rain on metal, and carried it to the stall. She didn't try to enter, didn't even open the door. She simply set the bucket on the ground outside the bars, close enough that if the stallion stretched his neck he could reach it, but far enough that he would have to make a choice to approach. Then she walked away, back to the feed room, and sat on an overturned crate where she could see him but wasn't directly facing him. This had been her pattern. Offer, retreat, wait. Never demand. Never force. Just present the possibility and let him decide. It took an hour before he moved. Grace had brought a thermos of coffee that Tom had pressed into her hands that morning, and she sipped it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, watching steam rise in small wisps. The stallion took one step forward, then stopped. His nostrils flared, processing the scent of the grain, probably also processing the scent of her. trying to determine if this was a trap. Another step, his hooves careful, testing the ground as if it might give way beneath him. Grace kept her eyes soft, not making direct contact, just aware in her peripheral vision. She had read once that predators stare, prey look away. She was trying to be neither. The stallion's muzzle finally reached the bucket, and Grace heard the sound of him lipping at the grain, then the crunch as he began to eat. She felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized was there. It was such a small victory, just a horse eating food that had been offered, but it felt monumental. It meant he was willing to accept something from her, even if trust was still miles away. She stayed on her crate until he finished, until he backed away from the empty bucket and returned to the far corner of his stall, and only then did she approach to retrieve the bucket. He watched her, tense but not panicked, and she spoke for the first time in his presence. "Good morning, Shadow." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's what I'm calling you, if you don't mind. Seems like you've been living in one long enough." The name had come to her on the second night, watching him move in the darkness of the barn, realizing that he seemed more comfortable in shadow than in light, as if brightness hurt something in him that went deeper than eyes. Shadow. Not the absence of light, but the evidence that light existed somewhere nearby. She wasn't sure if it was appropriate or presumptuous to name something that didn't belong to her, but she needed something to call him besides the stallion or that horse, and Shadow felt right in a way she couldn't articulate. By mid-morning, Tom had made his way down to the barn, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body no longer obeyed commands the way it once had. He leaned against the fence surrounding the paddock adjacent to the barn, watching Grace work. She was mucking out the empty stalls, the ones Shadow wasn't occupying, building up her routine, establishing a pattern of presence that wasn't threatening. Tom had brought a metal coffee thermos that he held in both hands, occasionally taking small sips. After a long silence, he spoke. "You remind me of someone." Grace paused, leaning on the pitchfork, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cold. Tom's eyes were distant, focused on something beyond the present. "My Martha," he continued. "She had a way with the broken ones too. Never believed an animal was beyond reach, just beyond what most people were willing to give. We had a mare once, back in the 70s, that had been beaten so badly she'd try to kill anyone who came near. Martha spent 8 months with that horse. 8 months of just existing in the same space, never asking for anything, just being there. One day, the mare walked up to her and put her head on Martha's shoulder. Just stood there, like she'd finally understood she was safe." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he took another sip of coffee to cover it. Grace felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them away. "What happened to the mare?" Tom smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Lived to be 32. Died in her sleep in the pasture over there, under that old cottonwood. Martha was with her at the end, holding her head, telling her she was loved." His gaze came back to the present, focusing on Grace. "What I'm saying is, what you're doing, it's the right way. But it's also the hardest way. Folks around here, they want quick results. They want a horse broke in 2 weeks so they can use it. They don't have patience for the slow work. You're going to face pressure to give up or do it their way." Grace nodded, already having felt the weight of judgment from the auction, already sensing that Ridgefield was the kind of town where everyone had an opinion about everyone else's business. Tom pushed off from the fence with a grunt. "Anyway, I'll leave you to it. There's more hay being delivered this afternoon, and I've got some old tack in the house that might be useful when the time comes." "If the time comes," he added, but not unkindly. Grace watched him make his slow way back to the house, a figure out of time, and felt grateful that of all the places she could have ended up, it was here, on land where someone understood what she was trying to do. The hay delivery came around 3 o'clock, a flatbed truck driven by a younger man with a face full of freckles and an easy smile. His name was Jake, and he worked for one of the neighboring ranches. He unloaded the bales with practiced efficiency, stacking them in the barn's loft, the physical labor making it look effortless. When he was done, he wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded toward Shadow's stall. "That the horse from the auction?" Words gotten around. Grace tensed, waiting for the judgment, But Jake just shook his head with something like admiration. That took guts. Most people wouldn't even try. He paused, then added, my little brother has cerebral palsy. Can't walk right, talks funny. People look at him like he's broken, like he's not worth the effort. But he's the smartest person I know, and the kindest. Sometimes things just need different approaches, you know? Grace felt something shift in her chest. The first hint that maybe not everyone in this town had written her off as crazy. Thank you, she said, meaning it for more than just the hay delivery. Jake tipped his hat and climbed back into his truck. If you need anything, Fletcher's got my number. And hey, there's a group of us who meet at the Copper Kettle on Friday nights. Nothing fancy, just coffee and pie. You'd be welcome if you wanted to come. He drove off before Grace could respond, leaving her standing in the barn doorway, dust motes swirling in the afternoon light. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Grace dragged a folding chair into the barn and positioned it outside Shadow's stall. She had stopped trying to do anything productive around him, had stopped trying to clean his stall or get closer. She just sat, a book open in her lap that she wasn't really reading, her presence a constant that demanded nothing. Shadow paced for a while, his hooves creating a rhythm against the floor. Then gradually he slowed, stopped, and stood facing her from the back of his stall. They existed like that for an hour, two beings in the same space, neither advancing nor retreating. The next day brought rain, a cold, steady downpour that turned the unpaved areas of the property into sucking mud and made the inside of the barn feel like a cave, dim and insulated from the world. Grace wore an old rain jacket that no longer kept out water, and by noon she was soaked through, her jeans heavy with moisture, her hair plastered to her skull. She continued her routine regardless, feeding, sitting, existing. Shadow seemed calmer in the rain, as if the sound of it drumming on the metal roof was soothing, a white noise that covered the world's sharper edges. Grace found herself humming along with the rhythm, no particular melody, just sound for the sake of sound. It was during one of these humming sessions that she noticed Shadow's ears swivel toward her, tracking the sound. She kept humming, watching from the corner of her eye as his head lowered slightly, as the tension in his shoulders eased by the smallest increment. It was the first time she had seen him relax even fractionally in her presence, and she felt a surge of something that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of connection. She hummed until her throat was dry, until the rain began to ease, until Shadow actually took a step closer to the front of his stall, drawn by something he probably didn't understand himself. On the sixth day, a truck pulled into the driveway, newer and cleaner than anything that had visited the property so far. Grace was in the paddock, repairing a section of fence that had rotted through, when she heard it. She looked up to see a woman in her early 30s climbing out, wearing practical clothes but with an air of professional competence. She carried a large bag over her shoulder and approached with confident steps. Grace set down her hammer and walked to meet her, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I'm Dr. Rachel Kim," the woman said, extending a hand that Grace shook. "I heard through the grapevine about your new acquisition, and I wanted to offer my services. I specialize in trauma-informed animal care, and I thought you might benefit from a professional assessment." Grace's first instinct was suspicion, wondering if this was someone sent to evaluate whether she was fit to keep Shadow. But Dr. Kim's eyes held no judgment, only genuine interest. "I don't have much money," Grace admitted. Dr. Kim waved this away. "Consider it pro bono. I'm building a practice here, and honestly, cases like this are what I got into veterinary medicine for. Most of my work is routine vaccinations and geldings. This is actually interesting." Grace led her to the barn, explaining in brief terms what she knew of Shadow's history, which wasn't much beyond what had been announced at the auction. Dr. Kim listened, occasionally nodding, her eyes taking in every detail of the barn setup, the clean water, the quality of hay, the distance Grace was maintaining. At Shadow's stall, she stopped, not approaching the bars, just observing. The stallion stood alert, eyes locked on this new presence, but he didn't panic. Dr. Kim stood still for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "He's not aggressive. He's hypervigilant. There's a difference. Aggressive animals display dominant behaviors, threats, attempts to control space. He's displaying survival behaviors, which means he's been put in situations where he had to fight to survive. Someone pushed him too hard, too fast, probably multiple someones. Grace felt anger kindle in her chest. Anger at people she'd never met who had taken this magnificent animal and broken him through impatience or cruelty or simple ignorance. Dr. Kim continued, still not looking away from Shadow. The good news is this is fixable. It'll take time, possibly months, but horses are incredibly resilient if given the chance. The key is going to be letting him set the pace. You can offer opportunities for interaction, but he has to be the one to close the distance. Force will only reinforce his belief that humans are threats. They spent the next hour with Dr. Kim explaining techniques, things Grace's father had taught her, but hearing them in professional terms gave them weight. Approach and retreat, pressure and release, the importance of reading body language, understanding that a horse's ear position, tail swish, weight distribution, all told a story if you knew how to read it. Dr. Kim also did a visual assessment, noting that Shadow appeared physically healthy aside from some weight loss and the emotional trauma. "I'll come back in a week," she said as she was leaving. "No charge, just curiosity. I want to see how he progresses. And Grace, you're doing everything right. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." After she left, Grace felt both validated and overwhelmed. Months. Dr. Kim had said months. Grace had enough money to last maybe another 3 weeks if she was careful, and then she'd need to find work, which would mean less time with Shadow, which could undo everything she was building. But she pushed these worries aside, focusing instead on the immediate. One day at a time, one moment at a time. That was all she could control. The following morning, Grace woke to find Tom standing by her truck, holding a steaming mug of coffee and what looked like a sandwich wrapped in paper. She climbed out, stiff and sore, and accepted both gratefully. Tom cleared his throat. "Been thinking. You can't keep sleeping in your truck. Winter's coming, and that's not sustainable. The spare room's yours if you want it. No rent increase, just common sense." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion she didn't trust herself to speak through, so she just nodded. Tom nodded back, understanding passing between them that didn't need words. She moved her things into the house that afternoon, a process that took all of 10 minutes since everything she owned fit in 4 trash bags and a backpack. The room was small but clean, with a bed that had a real mattress and a window that looked out over the pastures toward the mountains. There was a dresser with a mirror, and when Grace caught sight of herself, she barely recognized the face looking back. Thinner than she'd been, with shadows under her eyes and hair that needed cutting. But there was something else too, a determination that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that gave her features a sharpness they'd lacked. That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in weeks, Grace dreamed of her father. They were in the old barn back in Nevada, the one where he'd taught her everything he knew about horses. He was showing her how to approach an injured mare, his movements slow and deliberate, his voice a constant murmur of reassurance. "You have to see them, Gracie," he was saying. "Really see them. Not what you want them to be, not what they used to be, but what they are right now in this moment. That's where connection starts. In seeing." She woke with tears on her face and his voice still echoing in her ears, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was doing what he would have wanted, what he had trained her for without either of them knowing it at the time. The 8th day dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning where the world looked scrubbed clean and every edge was sharp. Grace went through her routine, which had become almost meditative in its repetition. Feed, water, sit, exist. But today, after Shadow had finished eating, and she had settled into her chair with a fresh cup of coffee Tom had pressed into her hands, something different happened. Shadow didn't retreat to the back of his stall. He stayed near the front, his head over the half door, and he watched her. Not with suspicion or fear, but with what might have been curiosity. Grace kept her eyes soft, not staring, just aware. Then, so slowly it seemed to take forever, Shadow stretched his neck forward, reaching toward where she sat about 6 feet away. He didn't have the reach to touch her, wasn't trying to, but the gesture itself was enormous. It was an offering, a question asked without words. Grace set down her coffee very carefully, not wanting any sudden movement to break whatever was happening. She stood, her heart hammering, and took one small step toward him. Shadow's ears flicked back, then forward again. Another step, Grace moving like she was underwater, every motion exaggerated in its slowness. She stopped 3 feet from his muzzle, close enough now that she could see the individual whiskers on his soft nose, the way his nostrils widened and contracted with each breath. She extended her hand, not reaching for him but presenting it, palm up, an offering of her own. Shadow's ears swiveled, processing. His eyes, which had been hard with distrust for days, softened by the smallest degree. And then, miracle of miracles, he stretched just a bit further and touched his nose to her palm. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds before he jerked back. But it had happened. They had touched. Grace felt tears stream down her face, hot against her cold cheeks, and she whispered thank you into the quiet barn, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking. Shadow for trusting her, her father for teaching her, the universe for leading her here, all of the above. She didn't push for more. She returned to her chair, picked up her coffee with shaking hands, and sat in the profound silence that followed. Shadow remained at the front of his stall, and for the first time since the auction, Grace saw him rest. One hip cocked, head lowered, eyes half closed. The posture of an animal that felt, if not safe, then at least not in immediate danger. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Later that morning, as Grace was mucking out the other stalls, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked out to see a vehicle she didn't recognize. It was a sensible sedan, slightly dusty, and when the door opened, a boy climbed out. He looked to be about 10, wearing a jacket too big for him and carrying something pressed against his chest. He walked toward the barn with an uneven gait, his feet not quite coordinating the way they should, and when he got close enough, Grace could see the determination on his young face warring with shyness. She set down her pitchfork and walked to meet him, crouching down slightly to be at his eye level. "Hi there," she said gently. The boy's mouth worked, sounds forming but not quite making it to words. Grace waited, not rushing, having learned patience from Shadow. Finally, the words came, stuttered and fought for but genuine. "I wanted to give you this." He held out what he'd been carrying, and Grace saw it was a drawing, carefully done in colored pencils on regular paper. It showed a black horse standing in a field, and though the artistic skill was that of a child, there was something captured in the lines that showed the artist had really looked, had seen not just a horse but this particular horse's spirit. Grace took the drawing with careful hands, treating it like the treasure it was. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice thick. "Did you draw this?" The boy nodded, a smile breaking through his nervousness. "I saw him at the auction. Everyone was laughing, but I thought he was sad, not scary." Grace felt her heart crack open a little more. "What's your name?" she asked. The boy straightened slightly, proud. Danny Reeves." Grace held out her hand for him to shake, which he did with the solemnity of someone performing an important ritual. "I'm Grace Bennett, and that's Shadow. Would you like to meet him?" Danny's eyes went wide, nodding so hard his whole body moved with it. Grace led him into the barn, explaining in a quiet voice that they had to be calm and slow, that Shadow was learning to trust and they didn't want to scare him. Danny absorbed every word with the seriousness of someone receiving sacred instructions. At Shadow's stall, Grace positioned Danny beside her, and together they stood quietly. Shadow, who had retreated slightly at the new presence, gradually eased forward, his curiosity apparently overcoming his caution. He looked at Danny, and Danny looked back, and something passed between them that Grace couldn't name but could feel. A recognition, perhaps. One being who had been judged and found wanting by a careless world seeing another who knew exactly what that felt like. Do you think he likes me?" Danny whispered. Grace smiled. "I think he sees someone who understands him," she whispered back. "And that's even better than liking." They stood together for a long time, the woman, the boy, and the horse, forming a triangle of quiet understanding in the dusty morning light of a barn that was slowly becoming a place of healing. When Danny finally left, collected by his mother who had been waiting patiently in the car, Grace pinned his drawing to the wall of the barn, right where Shadow could see it if he looked. It was the first decoration, the first sign that this place was becoming more than just a stable. It was becoming a sanctuary. The town of Ridgefield operated on rhythms that hadn't changed in generations. Morning coffee at the copper kettle, lunch discussions at the feed store, evening gossip spread through phone calls that lasted exactly as long as politeness required before becoming intrusive. Grace had become a topic of conversation that fell somewhere between curiosity and concern, whispered about in grocery store aisles and debated over Sunday dinners. Most people assumed she would fail, that Shadow would hurt her or escape or simply remain forever wild, and then she would leave town as quietly as she'd arrived. Another cautionary tale about the dangers of sentimentality overriding common sense. Grace felt the weight of these expectations every time she drove into town for supplies. The looks weren't always unkind, but they carried judgment nonetheless. Anderson's feed and supply, Frank Anderson had warmed to her slightly, occasionally offering advice about grain ratios or mentioning when hay would be on sale, but even his helpfulness carried an undertone of doubt. Betty Harper at the copper kettle served her coffee with a tight smile and asked pointed questions disguised as friendly concern. "How's that project of yours coming along? Still in one piece, I see. Must be keeping your distance, smart girl." The words were meant kindly but landed like small weights, accumulating until Grace felt their collective pressure. On a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the auction, Grace sat in a corner booth at the copper kettle, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and picking at a slice of apple pie she'd ordered more out of obligation than hunger. The diner was busy with the breakfast crowd, ranchers and retired men who treated this place like a second living room, their conversation flowing around her like water around a stone. She was reading a library book about equine psychology, one of a dozen she checked out using the temporary card the librarian had issued with obvious reluctance, when the bell above the door chimed and the entire diner went quiet. William Hartwell walked in with the assurance of someone who owned not just property but the very air people breathed. He was dressed in what Grace had come to recognize as his uniform: expensive jeans with a crisp crease, a button-down shirt that probably cost more than her truck, and boots that gleamed despite the dusty streets. His silver hair was perfect, his face showed no emotion, and his eyes swept the room in a way that made people straighten in their seats or suddenly find their plates fascinating. He nodded to a few people, murmured greetings that sounded rehearsed, and then his gaze landed on Grace. He walked directly to her booth, and Grace felt her stomach tighten. She marked her place in the book with a napkin and looked up, keeping her expression neutral. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. He smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Miss Bennett, may I sit?" It wasn't really a question despite being phrased as one. Grace gestured to the opposite bench, and Hartwell slid in with the ease of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. Betty appeared almost instantly, coffee pot in hand, her smile for Hartwell genuine in a way it never was for Grace. "William, good to see you." "The usual?" Hartwell nodded, and Betty poured his coffee and retreated, leaving them in a bubble of privacy created by everyone else in the diner, suddenly becoming very interested in their own conversations. Hartwell added cream to his coffee with precise movements, stirred exactly 3 times, and set the spoon down on the napkin with deliberate care. "I've been hearing interesting things about you," he said, his tone conversational. "Small towns talk, as I'm sure you've discovered." Grace said nothing, waiting. She had learned that silence was often more powerful than filling space with nervous words. Hartwell continued, unbothered by her lack of response. "That horse you bought, the one from my ranch. I'm curious how that's working out. Still alive? Still have all your fingers and toes?" His smile widened slightly, amused by his own joke. Grace wrapped her hands around her mug, feeling its warmth. "We're making progress," she said simply. Hartwell's eyebrows raised. Progress. Interesting word. Most people would consider it progress if that animal allowed them within 10 feet without trying to kill them. "He's allowed me closer than that," Grace said, immediately regretting giving him any information. Hartwell's expression sharpened with interest. "Is that so? Well, perhaps you have some natural talent I didn't recognize at the auction." He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Bennett. I admire persistence, even when it's misguided. That horse cost me considerable money 3 years ago. My son bought him on impulse, thought he could train him, make him into something special. He paused, and for just a moment something flickered across his face that might have been grief before the mask of control slid back into place. My son died before he could prove or disprove his theory. The horse became a liability, a reminder of poor judgment and wasted potential. Grace felt something soften in her chest despite her wariness. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it. Hartwell waved away her sympathy. It was 3 years ago. Life moves on. His eyes hardened again. "The point is that animal has dangerous habits and a documented history of violence. I let him go for a pittance because I wanted him off my property, but that doesn't mean I don't have concerns about what happens next. If he hurts someone, if he escapes and causes property damage, there will be legal ramifications. I wanted to make sure you understand that." Grace felt anger rise in her throat. "Is that a threat?" Hartwell's smile returned, cold and precise. "It's a reality check. I like you, Miss Bennett. You have spirit. But spirit doesn't pay medical bills or legal fees. I'm prepared to make you an offer, a generous one. Sell me that horse back for double what you paid. $200 is better than nothing, which is what you'll have when this experiment fails." Grace shook her head before he'd even finished speaking. "He's not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." Hartwell leaned back, studying her with the intensity of someone evaluating livestock. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. That horse is worthless except as a cautionary tale. Even if by some miracle you manage to gentle him, what then? You going to ride him? Show him? Breed him? He has no papers, no lineage anyone cares about. He's a genetic dead end and an economic liability. The smart move is to cut your losses now." Grace met his gaze, her own steady. "Maybe I'm not interested in smart moves. Maybe I'm interested in doing what's right." Hartwell's jaw tightened, the first crack in his controlled demeanor. "What's right?" he repeated, his voice taking on an edge. "Let me tell you what's right, Miss Bennett. What's right is recognizing when you're in over your head. What's right is not letting pride turn into tragedy. My son thought he knew better than everyone else too. Thought he could master that horse through sheer will. He was wrong, and it cost him everything." He stood abruptly, pulling bills from his wallet and dropping them on the table. "Far more than his coffee cost. Think about my offer. It expires when my patience does." He left without waiting for a response, and the diner's noise level gradually returned to normal, though Grace felt eyes on her from every direction. She sat for a long moment, her pie now completely unappetizing, her coffee cold. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not because of his threats, but because of what he'd revealed about his son. Shadow had been someone else's dream before. He'd become Grace's responsibility, and that dream had ended in death. She wondered if Hartwell saw her as a ghost of his son, doomed to repeat the same mistakes. Betty appeared to refill her coffee, her expression softer than before. "Don't let him get to you, honey. William Hartwell is used to getting what he wants, and it makes him mean when things don't go his way." Grace looked up, surprised by the support. Betty lowered her voice. "My daughter had a horse once. Rescued it from a bad situation. Everyone said she was crazy, that she'd get hurt. That horse lived 20 years and was the gentlest thing you ever saw. Sometimes the broken ones just need someone who won't give up on them." She squeezed Grace's shoulder briefly and moved on to another table, leaving Grace blinking back unexpected tears. She left money on the table and walked out into the cold morning, the sky a harsh blue that made everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. Her truck started on the third try, and she drove back to Fletcher's farm with Hartwell's words echoing in her head. When she pulled into the driveway, Tom was on the porch, and one look at her face made him set down his newspaper. Grace parked and walked over, suddenly exhausted. "Hartwell paid me a visit in town," she said without preamble. "Offered to buy Shadow back." Tom nodded slowly, unsurprised. "He's done that with others who've bought horses from him. Likes to maintain control even after the sale. You tell him no?" Grace nodded. Tom's weathered face creased into something that might have been approval. "Good. Man's got more money than sense and thinks the two are the same thing. He picked up his newspaper again, then paused. For what it's worth, Grace, I've seen a change in that horse already. Might not be obvious to others, but I've been around animals my whole life. He's settling. That's more than most thought possible. The words settled over Grace like a warm blanket, fortifying her against the cold wind and colder doubts. She spent the afternoon working with Shadow, though work was perhaps too strong a word for what they did. She simply existed in his presence, occasionally moving around the barn doing necessary tasks but never approaching him directly, never asking for anything. Shadow had begun spending more time at the front of his stall, watching her with what she chose to interpret as interest rather than suspicion. Once, when she was sweeping the aisle, he nickered softly, the sound so unexpected that she froze, hardly daring to breathe. It was the first voluntary vocalization he'd made toward her, and it felt like being handed a key to a door she hadn't known existed. That evening, as the sun set in spectacular fashion, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple that looked almost artificial, Danny appeared again. This time he wasn't alone. His mother walked beside him, a woman in her late 30s with kind eyes and the slightly frazzled look of someone managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. She introduced herself as Margaret Reeves, and her handshake was firm. "Danny's been talking about your horse non-stop," she said with a smile. "I had to see for myself what captured his imagination so completely." Grace showed them both into the barn, explaining her approach and warning that Shadow might not be receptive to visitors. But Danny moved with an instinctive understanding of how to be around nervous animals, his uneven gait actually an advantage because it meant his movements were slow and considered. He positioned himself near Shadow's stall and simply stood there, not trying to touch or interact, just being present. Margaret watched her son with an expression that was equal parts pride and heartbreak. "He doesn't make friends easily," she said quietly to Grace. "Kids can be cruel about his differences, but he has such a gift with animals. They don't judge him for his speech or his walk. They just see him." Shadow, for his part, seemed to recognize something in Danny. His ears stayed forward, his body relaxed, and after several minutes he actually approached the stall door, stretching his neck to sniff in Danny's direction. Danny's face lit up with a joy so pure it made Grace's chest ache. "He likes me," Danny whispered, the words coming easier in his excitement. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Grace found herself offering something she hadn't planned. "If you'd like, Danny could come by after school sometimes. Help me with barn chores, spend time with Shadow. Only if you're comfortable with it," she added quickly. Margaret looked at her son, then at Grace, then at the horse who had somehow bridged the gap between a traumatized animal and a lonely child. "I think that would be wonderful," she said. They established a routine. Danny would arrive 3 times a week after school, his mother dropping him off and returning an hour later. He would help Grace with simple tasks, filling water buckets, measuring grain, sweeping the aisle, and through it all he would talk to Shadow in his halting way, telling the horse about his day, his frustrations, his small victories. Shadow listened, ears swiveling, and gradually began to associate Danny's presence with safety and consistency. Grace watched this relationship develop with a mixture of joy and something deeper, a recognition that healing wasn't always a solitary journey, that sometimes connection happened in unexpected ways. One afternoon, Danny brought his sketchbook, the one he used for his drawings. He showed Grace page after page of horses in various poses, some clearly from memory, others imaginary. His talent was raw but undeniable, capturing movement and emotion with simple lines. When Shadow moved to the front of his stall, Danny quickly sketched him, his hand moving with more confidence than when he spoke. When he finished, he tore the page out carefully and handed it to Grace. "F for Shadow," he said. "So he knows someone sees him as beautiful, not scary." Grace took the drawing with trembling hands, looking at the image of Shadow captured not as he'd been at the auction, wild and furious, but as he was becoming, alert but calm, powerful but controlled. She taped it to the wall of the barn, right at horse-eye level, and whether Shadow understood the gesture or not, his gaze seemed to linger on the paper, on the image of himself rendered with love by a child who knew what it meant to be misunderstood. "Thank you, Danny," Grace said, her voice thick. "This is perfect." Danny beamed, and in that moment Grace understood that this barn was becoming something bigger than just her and Shadow. It was becoming a place where broken things could find their reflection in each other and, in that recognition, begin to heal. The following week brought the first real cold snap, temperatures dropping into the 20s overnight, frost coating everything by morning. Grace woke in her room at Tom's house, the window showing her a world transformed into something crystalline and beautiful. She dressed in layers, pulling on a coat that had been her father's, still carrying the faint smell of him even after all these years, and headed to the barn through grass that crunched under her boots. The mountains were sharp against a pale sky, and her breath clouded in front of her face, each exhale visible proof of life in the freezing air. Shadow had his winter coat coming in, the black darkening to something almost blue in certain light, and he seemed more comfortable in the cold than he had in the warmer days of September. Grace went through her morning routine, the tasks now familiar enough that her hands knew what to do while her mind wandered. She thought about Hartwell's warnings, about Danny's drawings, about the slow accumulation of small victories that felt both monumental and fragile. She thought about her father and wished desperately that he could see what she was doing, could offer advice or approval or simply his presence. As she was lost in these thoughts, Shadow did something he'd never done before. He walked to the front of his stall while she was standing right there, not 6 feet away but directly beside the door, and he pushed his nose through the bars, reaching toward her. Grace froze, afraid to breathe, afraid that any movement would shatter whatever was happening. Shadow's dark eyes were soft, his ears forward, his entire posture open in a way she'd never seen. Slowly, moving as though underwater, Grace lifted her hand and extended it toward him. Their previous contact had been brief, a touch so quick it might have been imagined. This was different. This was intentional. Shadow's muzzle met her palm and stayed there, warm breath flowing over her skin, whiskers tickling against her fingers. Grace felt tears stream down her face, hot against her cold cheeks, and she whispered words that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. "I see you. I see you, and you're not broken. You're just hurt, and that's different. That can heal." Shadow's eyes half closed, and for a long moment they stood connected, human and animal, two beings who had both learned that trust was dangerous but had decided to risk it anyway. When Shadow finally pulled back, Grace's hand fell to her side, but the warmth of that contact remained, burning like a brand or a promise. She stood there for a long time after, staring at her own hand as if it belonged to someone else, as if the simple act of touching had transformed her into something new. From the house, she heard Tom's door open and close, heard his slow footsteps approaching, but she didn't turn around. When he reached her side, he looked at her tear-stained face, then at Shadow standing calm in his stall, and he nodded as if confirming something he'd already known. "You've reached him," Tom said simply. "Now the real work begins." Grace wiped her face with her sleeve, laughing shakily. "That was the easy part?" Tom's smile was gentle. "That was the foundation. Everything else builds from here. But you've done what most said couldn't be done. You made that horse believe there might be something worth trusting in this world. And that, Grace, is no small thing." November arrived with a vengeance, bringing storms that rolled down from the mountains like invading armies, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud and making every task twice as difficult. Grace woke one morning to find the world buried under 6 inches of snow, the first real accumulation of the season, and everything transformed into something silent and strange. The barn roof was weighted with white, icicles hanging from the eaves like teeth, and her breath frosted the air inside Tom's house despite the fire he'd kept burning all night. She dressed in everything warm she owned, layering until she could barely move her arms, and trudged through the snow to the barn. Her boots disappeared with each step, the cold biting through her jeans, her hands already numb despite the gloves. Inside the barn, Shadow stood alert, his stall piled with extra straw she'd added the night before when the weather forecast had turned ominous. He nickered when he saw her, the sound now familiar and expected, and Grace felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with temperature. The work was harder in winter. Water buckets froze overnight and had to be thawed or replaced. Hay had to be increased to help the horses maintain body heat. The pathways between barn and house became treacherous with ice hidden under fresh snow. Grace developed new calluses on top of old ones. Her hands cracked and bleeding despite the lotion Tom kept pressing on her. Her back ached from hauling hay bales. Her shoulders protested every morning when she first moved. And she lost weight she couldn't afford to lose because the physical demands outpaced her ability to eat enough to compensate. But Shadow was thriving. The cold seemed to agree with him, and his coat came in thick and lustrous, the black so deep it looked almost liquid in certain light. More importantly, his trust in Grace had grown into something undeniable. He would come to the stall door when she called his name, would eat from a bucket she held in her hands, would allow her to brush him through the bars, though he still wouldn't permit her inside his space. They existed in a state of negotiated boundaries, each respecting what the other needed to feel safe, and the progress felt both glacial and miraculous depending on which moment you measured from. Danny continued his visits despite the cold, his mother now staying sometimes to watch, sitting on an overturned bucket with a thermos of coffee, her presence quiet but supportive. Danny had developed a routine with Shadow, arriving with drawings he'd completed at home, showing them to the horse as if Shadow were an art critic whose opinion mattered. And maybe it did, because Shadow would lower his head and seem to study the images, would snort softly as if offering commentary, and Danny would beam with pride. The boy's stammer had lessened noticeably, especially when talking to Shadow, as if the horse's acceptance had untied something in his throat. Dr. Rachel Kim came by every 2 weeks, her visits now less about assessment and more about friendship, though she always checked Shadow over with professional thoroughness. She brought supplies sometimes, donated medicine or equipment from her practice, and once she brought a bag of groceries that she claimed she'd bought too much of and didn't want to waste. Grace accepted with gratitude that made her voice thick, understanding that this was charity disguised as practicality, that Rachel saw her struggling and was helping in a way that preserved dignity. They would sit in Tom's kitchen after the barn work was done, drinking coffee and talking about anything except horses, and Grace began to remember what it felt like to have a friend. The town's attitude toward her had shifted subtly. She was no longer the crazy girl who'd bought the killer horse, she was now the stubborn girl who was somehow still alive, and that earned a different kind of respect. People nodded when she passed on the street. Frank Anderson started suggesting items she might need before she asked, and Betty at the Copper Kettle always made sure there was fresh pie when Grace came in. It wasn't acceptance exactly, more like provisional approval, but it felt significant nonetheless. It was on a Thursday afternoon, cold and gray with snow threatening, that everything changed. Grace was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when she heard vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles, their engines loud in the winter stillness. She straightened, pitchfork in hand, a sense of foreboding crawling up her spine. Through the barn door she saw 2 trucks pull into the driveway, both bearing the logo of Hartwell Ranch, and her stomach dropped. William Hartwell emerged from the first truck, dressed in an expensive coat that probably cost more than Grace's truck was worth, and Marcus Webb, his foreman, climbed from the second along with another ranch hand Grace didn't recognize. Tom came out of the house, moving faster than Grace had seen him move before, positioning himself between the trucks and the barn. Grace set down her pitchfork and walked out to join him, her heart hammering. Hartwell smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who'd cornered prey. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Fletcher, good afternoon. I hope I'm not interrupting." Tom crossed his arms, his voice gravelly with displeasure. "You're on my property uninvited, William. That's generally considered interrupting." Hartwell's smile didn't waver. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have business that can't wait." He pulled papers from inside his coat, unfolding them with precise movements. "These are county ordinances regarding the housing of dangerous animals. There have been complaints, concerns about public safety, and I'm here in my capacity as a county board member to ensure regulations are being followed." Grace felt ice in her veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What complaints? From who?" Hartwell's expression was sympathetic in a way that was clearly manufactured. "The specifics aren't important. What matters is that county code requires certain conditions be met when housing animals with documented aggressive histories. Inspections, insurance, specific fencing requirements. I have reason to believe you're not in compliance." Tom's face had gone red, his hands clenching into fists despite his age. "This is horseshit, William, and you know it. You're using your position to settle a personal score." Hartwell's eyes went cold. "I'm following the letter of the law, Tom. If you have an issue with that, you're welcome to take it up with the county commissioners." Marcus Webb had moved closer to the barn, and Grace saw him looking at Shadow's stall with an expression that was calculating. She stepped between him and the barn door, her voice steady despite her fear. "You're not going in there." Webb looked at Hartwell, who nodded slightly. "We have legal authority to inspect the premises, Miss Bennett. You can cooperate or we can return with the sheriff and a warrant. Your choice." Grace's mind raced, trying to find an angle, a way out, but she was trapped by her own lack of resources, her outsider status, her vulnerability in a system that favored men like Hartwell who knew how to manipulate rules to their advantage. Tom put a hand on her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Let them look," he said quietly. "We've got nothing to hide." Grace wanted to argue but saw the wisdom in not escalating. She stepped aside, and Webb moved past her into the barn, the other ranch hand following. Hartwell remained outside with Grace and Tom, his expression pleasant as if they were discussing the weather. "I want to be clear, Miss Bennett, that this isn't personal. I have genuine concerns about public safety. That horse put men in the hospital. He's unpredictable and dangerous. If something were to happen, if he were to escape or injure someone, the liability would be enormous." From inside the barn came the sound of Shadow reacting to the strangers, his hooves striking wood, a squeal of anger and fear. Grace's hands clenched so hard her nails drew blood from her palms, but she forced herself to stay still, to not run to him. Webb emerged a few minutes later, brushing hay from his jacket. "The animal appears contained," he reported to Hartwell. "Stall's solid. Fencing around the property meets minimum standards." Hartwell's jaw tightened, clearly displeased with this report. "What about insurance? Liability coverage?" He turned to Grace, his eyes sharp. "Do you have documentation proving you're insured against damages if that horse causes injury or property destruction?" Grace felt the trap close around her. She had no insurance, no way to afford insurance even if she'd known it was required. Her silence was answer enough. Hartwell nodded as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "County code requires proof of liability insurance for animals classified as dangerous, minimum coverage of $50,000. Without that documentation, I'm afraid I'll have to recommend to the county that the animal be removed from the property and placed in a facility equipped to handle such cases. Or," he added, his tone suggesting this was a reasonable compromise, "you could sell him back to me. I have the facilities and insurance. The horse would be properly contained, and you'd be compensated fairly." Tom started to speak, his voice rising, but Grace cut him off. She looked directly at Hartwell, seeing behind his civilized words to the determination underneath, understanding that this had been his plan all along. The auction, her purchase, all of it had been part of a longer game she hadn't seen until now. "You want him dead," she said flatly. Hartwell's expression flickered, surprise quickly masked. "I want what's best for everyone involved." Grace shook her head. "No, you want him gone because he reminds you of your son, because every day he's alive is a reminder of failure you can't control. So you'll use the law and your position to make him disappear, and you'll call it public safety." The words hung in the cold air, and for a moment Hartwell's mask slipped entirely, rage and grief and something broken flashing across his face before he reassembled his composure. "You have 1 week," he said, his voice tight. 1 week to provide proof of insurance or agree to surrender the animal. After that, I'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement." He turned and walked back to his truck, Webb and the other hand following. The trucks pulled away, tires spinning slightly in the snow, and the silence they left behind was suffocating. Grace found she couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in her ears. Tom was talking, saying something about lawyers and fighting this, but the words couldn't penetrate the panic flooding her system. She walked into the barn where Shadow stood at the back of his stall, sides heaving, eyes rolling white. The strangers had terrified him, undoing weeks of progress in minutes, and Grace felt rage so pure it burned away everything else. She approached his stall slowly, speaking in a voice that shook despite her efforts to control it. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I won't let them take you. Promise." That night, Grace barely slept, her mind cycling through impossible scenarios. She had no money for insurance, no connections to people who could help, no legal standing to fight someone like Hartwell. By morning, she felt hollowed out, defeated before the battle had truly begun. She went through her routine mechanically, feeding Shadow and the 2 other rescue horses that had arrived over the past weeks. Referrals from Rachel, who knew Grace would never turn away an animal in need. The small herd had become a family of sorts, the newcomers taking cues from Shadow, learning from his growing trust that maybe humans weren't all threats. Danny arrived after school, and one look at Grace's face made his smile fade. What's wrong?" Grace tried to explain in terms a child would understand, about rules and insurance and powerful people who made decisions that weren't fair. Danny listened with the seriousness of someone twice his age, then said something that cut through Grace's despair like a blade. My mom works at the county office. She knows things. Maybe she can help." It was a slim thread, but Grace grabbed it like a lifeline. Margaret Reeves came by that evening, and Grace explained the situation while Tom sat on the porch, his presence solid and supportive. Margaret listened, asking questions, taking notes in a small spiral notebook, her expression growing more troubled as the story unfolded. "What Hartwell's doing is legal in the technical sense," she said finally. "The ordinances he cited do exist, though they're rarely enforced. But there might be a way around this." She paused, looking between Grace and Tom. "This property is zoned agricultural, and there are provisions for animal sanctuaries and rescue operations that have different requirements. If you were to officially register as a rescue, the insurance requirements change. They're still substantial, but there are grants available, non-profit organizations that help with startup costs." Grace felt hope kindle, fragile but real. How long would that take? Margaret bit her lip. "Normally, months. But I know people in the state office, and with the right pressure, with enough documentation showing need and capability, we might be able to expedite." She met Grace's eyes. "I can't promise anything, but let me make some calls." Grace wanted to cry, wanted to throw her arms around this woman who barely knew her, but was willing to help. But she settled for a whispered thank you that carried the weight of everything she couldn't articulate. Margaret squeezed her hand. "Danny talks about Shadow constantly, about you and what you're building here. If we can help preserve that, it's worth fighting for." The next week was a blur of paperwork and phone calls, of Margaret coaching Grace through applications and Tom providing documentation of the property's history and suitability. Rachel wrote letters on official veterinary letterhead attesting to the quality of care and the viability of the rescue concept. Frank Anderson provided statements about Grace's responsibility and character. Even Betty Harper at the Copper Kettle wrote something, though Grace never saw what it said, only heard from Margaret that it had been surprisingly eloquent. The town, it seemed, had decided Grace was one of them now, and they protected their own. On the 6th day, with Hartwell's deadline looming like a guillotine, Margaret called with news. The paperwork had been fast-tracked, the rescue designation approved pending a site inspection that had been scheduled for the following week, conveniently after Hartwell's ultimatum expired. More importantly, a coalition of animal welfare organizations, coordinated by Rachel's connections, had pooled resources to provide temporary insurance coverage, enough to meet the minimum requirements. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a reprieve, time to build something sustainable. Grace sat down hard on Tom's porch steps when she heard, her legs simply giving out, and she sobbed with relief so intense it hurt. The confrontation with Hartwell came on the 7th day. He arrived alone this time, clearly expecting to find Grace defeated and ready to surrender. Instead, he found her standing in the barn doorway with Tom on one side and Margaret on the other, and the expression on his face when Margaret handed him the documentation was almost worth everything Grace had been through. "This is proof of insurance," Margaret said, her voice professional and cool. "And this is the approval letter for Fletcher Farm Animal Sanctuary. registered with the state as of yesterday. All county requirements have been met. Hartwell read through the papers, his jaw working, and when he looked up his eyes were cold enough to cause frostbite. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Grace met his gaze, no longer intimidated. "Yes," she replied. "It is." After he left, Grace walked into the barn where Shadow stood watching, calm despite the tension he must have sensed. She opened his stall door for the first time, the gesture slow and deliberate, giving him every opportunity to refuse. Shadow looked at the open door, at Grace standing in the opening, and made a choice. He walked forward, head lowered, and stepped out of the stall into the aisle where Grace waited. She didn't try to touch him, didn't reach for a halter or rope. She simply turned and walked toward the barn doors that opened onto the paddock, and Shadow followed, his hooves echoing in the quiet space. Outside, the winter sun was bright on snow, the mountains sharp against a blue sky, and the world felt scrubbed clean and full of possibility. Grace walked into the paddock, a shadow at her shoulder, and for the first time since the auction, she felt the coiled fear in her chest begin to unwind. They stood together in the snow, woman and horse, both scarred, both healing, both having chosen to trust when every past experience had taught them that trust was dangerous. Tom watched from the fence, Margaret and Danny beside him, and Rachel pulled up in her truck just in time to see Shadow lower his great head and rest it on Grace's shoulder, a gesture of such complete trust that everyone watching felt tears prick their eyes. The rescue grew from there, word spreading through networks Grace hadn't known existed, other horses arriving with their own stories of neglect or abuse or simple bad luck. Grace hired help as donations trickled in, young people looking for purpose and finding it in the hard work of rehabilitation. Danny became a permanent fixture, his artwork now decorating the barn and the small website Margaret helped Grace build. Tom thrived with renewed purpose, his days filled with the sounds of life and healing. Rachel became not just a friend but a partner in the work, her expertise invaluable. Shadow remained the heart of it all, the first and most important, living proof that the most broken things weren't beyond saving if someone was willing to do the patient, unglamorous work of simply being present. He learned to accept a halter, then a bridle, and eventually Grace rode him for the first time, not in the showy way of rodeos or competitions, but quietly in the early morning when the world was still and the only witnesses were the mountains and the sky. He was powerful and careful beneath her, his stride smooth, and Grace understood that this wasn't about dominance or training. It was about partnership built on mutual respect and hard-won trust. On a spring morning, nearly a year after the auction, Grace stood in the paddock watching the small herd graze, Shadow among them but somehow apart, still carrying himself with the dignity of something that had survived what should have destroyed it. The farm had evolved beyond her wildest hopes, becoming a place where people brought not just horses but themselves, seeking healing they couldn't name but recognized when they saw it reflected in the eyes of animals who had also known suffering. Grace was no longer the desperate girl with $100 and a prayer. She was the founder of something meaningful, the keeper of a sanctuary that had saved her as much as she'd saved it. Tom called from the porch, his voice strong despite his years, announcing that coffee was ready and there were visitors coming up the drive. Grace turned to see a truck she didn't recognize, and when it parked, a family emerged, parents and 2 children, and they looked at the horses with the kind of hope that Grace remembered from her own first days here. She walked to meet them, Shadow raising his head to watch her go, his ears forward, and in that moment Grace understood that the work would never be finished, that there would always be another horse, another person, another chance to choose compassion over convenience, patience over speed, understanding over force. The story that had begun with laughter and mockery at an auction had transformed into something larger than its component parts, a ripple effect of healing that touched everyone it reached. Grace didn't know where it would lead, what challenges lay ahead, what battles would need fighting or what losses would have to be endured. But she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And that Shadow, the untamable horse that everyone had given up on, had taught her the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't trying to fix what's broken. It's being willing to stand beside it, to witness its pain without trying to erase it, and to offer the radical gift of acceptance without conditions or expectations. In the end, that was what saved them both. The spring turned into summer, and the sanctuary found its rhythm in the lengthening days and warmth that coaxed wildflowers from the meadows. Grace woke each morning to birdsong instead of alarm clocks, her body now attuned to the natural cycles of the land and the animals who depended on her. The work had become both easier and harder, easier because routines were established and help had arrived, harder because success brought visibility and visibility brought scrutiny of a different kind than Hartwell's antagonism. A journalist from a regional magazine had written a piece about the sanctuary, focusing on Shadow's transformation and the broader mission of rehabilitation over disposal. The article had been sympathetic, even glowing, and it had brought an influx of attention that Grace wasn't entirely prepared for. Donations increased, which was desperately needed, but so did the number of people who showed up unannounced wanting tours or hoping to drop off animals without understanding the careful intake process required. Grace found herself spending more time managing people than horses, a shift that exhausted her in ways the physical labor never had. One afternoon in late June, a sleek car pulled into the driveway, expensive and out of place against the backdrop of the weathered barn and dusty paddocks. Grace was working with one of the newer rescues, a gray mare who had been starved nearly to death before animal control had seized her, and she didn't immediately approach the vehicle. Through the car's tinted windows she could see movement but not details, and something about the deliberate way the engine stayed running made her uneasy. Finally, the driver's door opened and a woman emerged, probably in her early 40s, dressed in clothes that were stylish but practical enough to suggest she knew her way around rural settings. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore sunglasses that she removed as she surveyed the property. Grace set down the brush she'd been using and walked over, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, extending her hand. "I hope so. My name is Catherine Brennan. I'm a documentary filmmaker from Portland, and I'm working on a project about animal rescue operations in the West. I read about your sanctuary and I'd love to discuss the possibility of featuring your work." Grace shook her hand warily, her mind immediately suspicious of cameras and exposure. Catherine seemed to read her hesitation because she quickly added, "I know you probably get approached a lot, and I understand if you're protective of your privacy and the animal's well-being. I'm not interested in exploitation or sensationalism. What you've built here, what you've accomplished with that stallion everyone said was hopeless. It's a story that deserves to be told properly. Not as entertainment, but as education about what's possible when we change our approach to animals we've labeled as problems." They talked for over an hour, Catherine sitting on the porch steps with a bottle of water Tom had brought out, asking thoughtful questions and listening to Grace's answers with genuine interest. She explained her vision for the documentary, a series that would follow several rescue operations over the course of a year, showing the unglamorous reality of the work alongside the moments of breakthrough and connection. She wanted to challenge the narrative that some animals were beyond help, wanted to examine the systems that created these situations in the first place. Grace found herself warming to the idea despite her reservations, seeing an opportunity to reach people who might never otherwise understand what rescue work truly entailed. They agreed to a trial period. Catherine would return with her small crew in a few weeks and film some preliminary footage, and if it felt wrong or invasive, Grace could pull out without commitment. It felt like a reasonable compromise, and after Catherine left, Grace stood in the driveway feeling the weight of a decision she wasn't entirely sure about but sensed might be important in ways she couldn't yet articulate. Tom came out with 2 glasses of lemonade, handing her one with a knowing look. "Scared?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Terrified." "Good," Tom said. "Means you're taking it seriously. Just remember why you're doing this. Not for fame or recognition, but because every person who understands what's possible here is one more person who might choose patience over convenience next time they encounter something difficult." The filming began in mid-July, and it was as intrusive and uncomfortable as Grace had feared, cameras following her through morning routines, boom microphones hovering just out of frame, Catherine asking her to repeat actions or statements for better angles. But there was also something validating about having the work documented, about seeing through Catherine's lens how far Shadow had come, how the other horses had transformed under consistent care, how Danny's confidence had bloomed alongside his relationship with the animals. The crew was respectful, learning quickly when to film and when to put cameras down, and gradually Grace stopped noticing their presence, stopped performing and simply existed as she normally would. One sequence they captured would become the emotional center of the documentary, though none of them knew it at the time. It was an ordinary morning, nothing special planned, and Grace was working with Shadow in the round pen they'd built that spring. She had progressed to riding him regularly now, but this day she wanted to do groundwork, reinforcing communication and connection without the complication of being mounted. She sent Shadow out to circle the pen, not with force but with intention, her body language clear, and Shadow responded with the fluid grace of an athlete who knew exactly what was being asked. They moved together through various exercises, Shadow changing gaits at subtle cues, coming to Grace when she lowered her energy and turned her back, following her around the pen with his nose nearly touching her shoulder. It was beautiful to watch. This dance between human and horse that spoke of trust so complete it looked effortless, though anyone who understood the work knew it represented countless hours of patient repetition and mutual respect. Catherine's cameras caught all of it, including the moment when Grace stopped in the center of the pen, turned to face Shadow, and simply stood with her arms loose at her sides. Shadow approached until they were close enough to share breath, and then he did something he'd never done in front of witnesses. He lowered himself into a bow, front legs folding, head dipping low, offering Grace the kind of submission that wasn't about dominance but about honor, a recognition of what she'd given him. Grace's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide, and she placed both hands on Shadow's neck, leaning her forehead against his, and the stillness that followed was so profound that even the sound technician would later say he'd never heard silence that full. When Catherine showed Grace the footage weeks later, during the editing process, Grace watched herself on screen and barely recognized the person she saw. This woman looked strong, capable, certain of her purpose in ways that the desperate girl at the auction could never have imagined. Shadow on screen was equally transformed, no longer the wild-eyed dangerous animal of reputation but something majestic and knowing, his power channeled rather than suppressed. "This is it," Catherine said quietly. "This is the moment that will make people understand. Not the dramatic rescue, not the conflict with Hartwell, but this quiet demonstration of what relationship looks like when it's built on the right foundation." The documentary premiered that fall at a film festival in Seattle, and Catherine invited Grace to attend. Grace had never been to Seattle, had barely been anywhere, and the city overwhelmed her with its noise and density and the sheer number of people compressed into small spaces. But the screening itself was extraordinary, sitting in a dark theater surrounded by strangers, watching her life and Shadow's story unfold on a screen that made everything seem both larger and more intimate than reality. When the moment of Shadow's bow played, the entire audience seemed to hold its breath, and when the credits rolled, the applause was sustained and genuine. People approached her afterward, strangers with tears in their eyes, telling her how the film had moved them, how they were going to look at animals differently, how they wanted to support the sanctuary's work. Grace felt overwhelmed and grateful and slightly fraudulent, as if she'd stumbled into someone else's life and was being praised for achievements she didn't feel worthy of claiming. But Catherine pulled her aside during the reception and said something that would stay with Grace forever. "You gave that horse a chance when no one else would. You risked everything for something most people considered worthless. That's not luck or accident. That's character. Own it." The documentary's success brought more donations, enough that Grace could finally pay herself a small salary and hire additional help. The sanctuary expanded, adding more stalls, improving facilities, establishing a volunteer program that brought people from across the region to learn about trauma-informed animal care. Danny, now older and more confident, began teaching other children how to approach and work with nervous horses, his own journey from isolation to connection becoming a teaching tool. Tom's health improved with the increased activity and purpose, and he often joked that the sanctuary had added years to his life, though his eyes would grow distant sometimes and Grace knew he was thinking of Martha, wishing she could see what her old training grounds had become. William Hartwell never apologized, never acknowledged that he'd been wrong, but he also never returned to challenge the sanctuary's existence. Grace heard through the town's gossip network that he'd watched the documentary, that something in it had affected him in ways people couldn't quite define. Once, passing through town, Grace saw him standing outside the feed store, and their eyes met across the street. He didn't smile or wave, but he gave her a single nod, a gesture so small it might have been imagined, and then he turned and walked away. It wasn't reconciliation or redemption, but it was acknowledgement, and Grace found that was enough. Years passed, marked by seasons and the arrival of new animals, each with their own stories of survival and resilience. Shadow remained the heart of the sanctuary, growing older with Grace, his black coat now flecked with white around his muzzle, his movements slower but no less dignified. He had become something of a legend, people traveling from distant states just to see the untamable horse who had learned to trust, to stand in his presence and feel whatever it was that drew them to this place of healing. On the anniversary of Grace's first day at the sanctuary, now celebrated as Founders' Day by the staff and volunteers, Grace stood in the paddock at dawn watching Shadow graze alongside the herd he'd become patriarch to. The mountains were pink with sunrise, the air cool and clean, and Grace felt the kind of peace that comes not from absence of struggle, but from knowing the struggle has meaning. She thought about the girl who'd raised her hand at an auction with nothing but intuition and desperation, thought about all the moments of doubt and fear and grinding work that had led to this morning, this place, this life she'd somehow built from nothing but stubbornness and love. Shadow lifted his head, ears forward, looking directly at her across the distance, and Grace felt the connection that still existed between them, invisible but unbreakable, forged in those early days when they'd both been so damaged they could barely function. They had saved each other, though Grace suspected Shadow had done more of the saving, had given her purpose and direction when she'd been drifting, had taught her that the most profound transformations happen slowly, in silence, when we stop trying to force outcomes and simply show up consistently with open hands and patient hearts. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and the day began with its usual demands and small miracles. Grace walked back to the barn where others were already stirring, coffee brewing in Tom's kitchen, Danny arriving early before school to spend time with the horses, volunteers checking their schedules and preparing for the work ahead. This was her life now, built from the wreckage of a past she'd run from and the single choice to believe that broken didn't mean finished, that with enough time and care and willingness to meet beings where they were rather than where we wanted them to be, healing was always possible. Shadow had taught her that. The untamable horse had been her greatest teacher, and every day was another lesson in what it meant to truly see another being and offer them the radical gift of acceptance without conditions. That was the work. That had always been the work. And Grace knew with certainty that she would continue doing it for as long as she had breath and strength, because some callings weren't chosen but recognized, and hers had found her on a September morning at an auction when she'd raised her hand and changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.